Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I need to speak with you about something that happened in the early hours of Saturday morning, something that changes more than what most people realize. While the world watched American forces extract Nicolas Maduro from Venezuelan soil, while headlines focused on drug trafficking charges and military precision, a different kind of operation was already in motion. Something that had been planned for months, perhaps years. Something that makes Maduro's capture look like the opening move rather than the endgame. Because what almost no one is discussing is what was activated the moment those helicopters left Caracas, what was triggered in the financial networks that connect Beijing to the Western Hemisphere, and why the timing of this operation coincides with currency agreements that were never meant to be public knowledge. The operation was designed to look spontaneous, but nothing about the timing was accidental. While American special forces moved through Venezuelan airspace with surgical precision, while Nicolas Maduro and his wife found themselves aboard the USS Iwo Jima facing narco-terrorism charges, a parallel set of protocols was activating across financial networks that most people never see. The infrastructure had been in place for months, waiting for exactly this moment, waiting for the precise instant when Venezuela's government would be decapitated and $60 billion in Chinese investments would suddenly need new management structures. You have to understand what China had built in Venezuela over the past 15 years, because it wasn't just loans and oil contracts. It was something much deeper, much more systemic, something that transforms a country's economic sovereignty into something else entirely. When Hugo Chavez first courted Beijing in the early 2000s, when he offered Venezuelan crude in exchange for Chinese infrastructure investment, he thought he was diversifying away from American influence. What he actually did was create a dependency mechanism that would outlast any individual leader, outlast any political system, outlast any coup or intervention or regime change. The $60 billion that China poured into Venezuela, between 2007 and 2018, was not just money. It was a transformation protocol. Every highway built by Chinese companies, every power plant installed with Chinese technology, every telecommunications network running Chinese software became part of a larger system. A system designed to survive political transitions and maintain operational continuity, regardless of who controlled Caracas. When American forces extracted Maduro, they weren't just removing a dictator. They were activating the next phase of a financial architecture that had been waiting for exactly this kind of disruption. Because here's what almost no one realized while watching those military helicopters on Saturday morning. The extraction was not the end of Chinese influence in Venezuela, it was the beginning of its institutionalization. The moment Maduro disappeared from Venezuelan soil, the moment his government ceased to function, all of those Chinese-built systems, all of those infrastructure projects, all of those special economic zones suddenly needed new management protocols. And China had been preparing for exactly this contingency, had been building legal frameworks and financial instruments that would allow them to maintain operational control regardless of what political entity emerged to replace the Maduro regime. The timing was uncoincidental because Chinese financial strategists had been gaming out this exact scenario since 2023, since Trump first announced his intention to remove Maduro from power, since American naval forces began their buildup in Caribbean waters. Every month that passed between that announcement and Saturday, this operation gave China additional time to restructure their Venezuelan investments, additional time to convert loan obligations into operational partnerships, additional time to build financial instruments that would survive a regime change. What looked like an American military victory was actually the triggering event for a Chinese economic consolidation that had been years in preparation. When you examine the infrastructure that China built in Venezuela over the past decade, when you look at the power grids and transportation networks and telecommunication systems that Chinese companies installed throughout the country, you begin to understand that these weren't just development projects, they were integration protocols. Every Chinese-built system in Venezuela was designed to require ongoing Chinese technical support, ongoing Chinese spare parts, ongoing Chinese operational expertise. This created a dependency relationship that made Chinese withdrawal from Venezuela almost impossible, regardless of political changes in Caracas. But the deeper strategy becomes visible when you realize that all of these Chinese infrastructure investments were structured as collateralized loans backed by Venezuelan oil production, which means that any disruption to Venezuelan political stability automatically triggered Chinese management rights over the collateral assets. The moment Maduro's government ceased functioning, the moment Venezuelan oil production fell under uncertain political control, China's legal agreements gave them automatic operational authority over the infrastructure systems they had financed. This wasn't debt collection. This was the execution of a predetermined transition protocol that had been embedded in every Chinese investment contract since 2015. The scale of Chinese investment in Venezuela becomes clearer when you realize that $60 billion represents more money than most countries see in a decade. But the financing structure wasn't designed like traditional international loans. It was designed like something else entirely, something that creates permanent dependencies rather than temporary obligations. Every dollar that flowed from Chinese state banks to Venezuelan infrastructure projects came with conditions that most people never examined. Conditions that essentially guaranteed Chinese operational control, regardless of political changes in Caracas. Consider what happens when a country borrows $60 billion for infrastructure development and then discovers that the infrastructure can only be maintained by the lending country's technical specialists, can only be upgraded using the lending country's technology platforms, can only be operated through the lending country's management systems. This isn't debt in any traditional sense. This is integration. This is the creation of economic dependencies that survive political transitions and make regime change almost irrelevant from a strategic perspective. When Venezuela began defaulting on Chinese loans in 2016, when oil revenues collapsed and the Maduro government could no longer meet its payment obligations, most analysts assumed that China would cut its losses and withdraw from the Venezuelan market. Instead, something much more sophisticated happened, something that revealed the true purpose of the financing structure. China didn't demand immediate repayment, didn't seize Venezuelan assets, didn't impose austerity measures or structural adjustment programs. Instead, they converted debt obligations into operational agreements, transformed loan defaults into management contracts, turned financial dependency into direct control over critical infrastructure systems. This is where the currency dimension becomes crucial, because the debt-to-equity conversions that China negotiated with Venezuela weren't denominated in dollars. They were structured around yuan-based payment systems that effectively removed American financial oversight from the relationship. Every time Venezuela converted Chinese debt into operational partnerships, every time they agreed to Chinese management of Venezuelan infrastructure, they were simultaneously agreeing to conduct those relationships outside the dollar-based international financial system. The timing of this currency transition becomes significant when you realize that it was accelerating throughout 2024 and 2025. Even as American sanctions tightened, even as Venezuelan political instability increased, China wasn't just maintaining its investments in a failing state. It was systematically converting those investments into permanent operational control structures that would survive any political transition, including the kind of intervention that would ultimately remove Maduro from power. But the real sophistication of the Chinese strategy becomes visible when you examine how they structured their Venezuelan investments to complement their broader de-dollarization objectives across Latin America. Venezuela wasn't just a bilateral relationship for Beijing, it was a regional headquarters, a testing ground for financial instruments and operational protocols that could be replicated across other Latin American markets. Every yuan-denominated transaction that China negotiated with Venezuela, every infrastructure project that China managed outside the dollar system, every technological integration that China achieved in Venezuelan markets became a template for similar arrangements with Brazil, with Argentina, with other countries, seeking alternatives to American financial dominance. The yuan swap agreements that China negotiated with Venezuela starting in 2018 were not just currency arrangements. They were the foundation for a parallel financial system that could operate independently of American oversight, independently of dollar-denominated clearing systems, independently of the regulatory frameworks that gave Washington leverage over international financial transactions. When Venezuelan officials announced that 85% of their trade with China would be conducted in yuan rather than dollars, they weren't just diversifying their currency exposure. They were participating in the construction of a multipolar financial architecture that could challenge American monetary hegemony. This is where Saturday's operation takes on additional significance, because the extraction of Maduro doesn't eliminate Chinese financial infrastructure in Venezuela. It actually accelerates its institutionalization. The moment Venezuelan political authority became uncertain, the moment the Maduro government ceased to function, all of those yuan-denominated financial agreements, all of those Chinese operational partnerships, all of those infrastructure management contracts automatically became the de facto governing framework for large sections of the Venezuelan economy. China didn't need to intervene politically to maintain its influence, because its influence had already been embedded in the operational structure of Venezuelan economic life. What most people missed while watching American military forces extract Maduro from Caracas was the timing of the operation relative to currency movements that had been accelerating for months across Chinese trade networks in Latin America. Movements that suggested the extraction had been anticipated and prepared for by financial strategists in Beijing who understood that political instability in Venezuela would create opportunities rather than risks for Chinese economic expansion in the region. The yuan's role in Venezuelan trade had been growing steadily since 2023, but the pace of that growth accelerated dramatically in the weeks leading up to Saturday's operation, almost as if Chinese financial institutions knew that they would soon need alternative payment systems that could function independently of Venezuelan government authorization, payment systems that could continue operating even if the political authority in Caracas ceased to exist or fell under American control. Consider what happens to international financial relationships when the government that negotiated those relationships suddenly disappears, when the political authority that guaranteed payment obligations and operational agreements is extracted by foreign military forces and flown to American custody. Under normal circumstances, such political disruption would create massive uncertainty for foreign investors, would trigger capital flight and contract renegotiations, and potentially catastrophic losses for anyone with significant exposure to the destabilized market. But China had been preparing for exactly this scenario, had been restructuring its Venezuelan relationships in ways that would actually benefit from political instability rather than suffer from it. Every yuan-denominated transaction that China negotiated with Venezuela over the past 18 months included provisions for operational continuity in the event of government transitions. Provisions that would allow Chinese companies to maintain control over infrastructure projects and resource extraction operations, regardless of who controlled the political apparatus in Caracas. The sophistication of this preparation becomes clear when you realize that China's yuan swap arrangements with Venezuela were not just bilateral currency agreements. They were the foundation for a regional financial network that could absorb Venezuelan economic activity into a broader Chinese sphere of influence. When Venezuelan trade with China shifted from dollar-denominated transactions to yuan-denominated transactions, when Venezuelan oil exports began flowing to Chinese refineries under yuan-based pricing agreements, Venezuela was essentially integrating into a Chinese economic zone that extended across multiple Latin American countries. This regional integration strategy explains why China's response to Saturday's operation was so measured, why Chinese officials expressed concern about Venezuelan sovereignty, while simultaneously announcing their intention to protect Chinese investments and operational partnerships in Venezuelan markets. China wasn't losing a client state when Maduro was extracted. They were gaining an opportunity to convert their informal economic influence into formal operational control over critical Venezuelan infrastructure systems. The yuan consolidation that had been accelerating in Venezuelan markets since late 2024 was not just currency diversification. It was preparation for exactly this kind of political transition. Preparation that would allow Chinese economic interests to survive and potentially thrive during the chaos that inevitably follows regime change. When American forces removed the Venezuelan government, they inadvertently eliminated the primary obstacle to Chinese economic consolidation in Venezuelan markets. Because here's what becomes visible when you examine the financial flows that were accelerating in the months before Saturday's operation. China was not just maintaining its investments in an unstable political environment. They were systematically converting those investments into forms that would be protected from political instability, forms that would actually benefit from the removal of Venezuelan political authority. Every infrastructure project that China converted from loan finance to equity controlled, every operational agreement that China shifted from government to company, every transaction that China moved from dollar-denominated to yuan-denominated was preparation for the post-Maduro environment that Chinese strategists knew was coming. The timing of these conversions suggests that Chinese intelligence services had advanced knowledge of American intervention plans, had enough lead time to restructure their Venezuelan investments in ways that would survive regime change and potentially prosper under whatever political arrangement emerged to replace the Maduro government. This wasn't reactive crisis management. This was proactive positioning for an anticipated political transition that would create opportunities for Chinese economic expansion rather than obstacles to Chinese economic interests. The genius of Chinese infrastructure strategy in Venezuela becomes visible when you realize that every power plant, every telecommunications network, every transportation system that China built over the past 15 years was designed not just to provide services, but to create irreversible dependencies that would survive any political transition and guarantee Chinese influence, regardless of who controlled the government in Caracas. This wasn't development assistance. This was the construction of permanent leverage mechanisms that would operate independently of political relationships. Consider what China accomplished when they modernized Venezuelan electrical infrastructure through partnerships that required ongoing Chinese technical support, ongoing Chinese spare parts, ongoing Chinese operational expertise. The moment those systems became operational, Venezuela lost the ability to maintain its own electrical grid, lost the technical capacity to upgrade its own power generation systems, lost the industrial capability to produce the components necessary for electrical network maintenance. This created a dependency relationship that made Chinese withdrawal from Venezuelan markets almost impossible, regardless of political changes in Caracas. But the electrical infrastructure was only the beginning because Chinese companies simultaneously took control of Venezuelan telecommunications networks, Venezuelan port facilities, Venezuelan transportation corridors, Venezuelan mining operations, creating an integrated system of dependencies that reinforced each other and made Venezuelan economic sovereignty increasingly fictional. Every Chinese-controlled system in Venezuela was designed to interface with every other Chinese-controlled system, creating operational synergies that made Chinese management of Venezuelan infrastructure more efficient than Venezuelan management of Venezuelan infrastructure. The sophistication of this integration becomes clear when you examine how Chinese infrastructure investments in Venezuela were coordinated with Chinese infrastructure investments across Latin America, creating regional networks that connected Venezuelan oil production to Chinese refineries through Chinese-controlled shipping routes, Chinese-controlled port facilities, Chinese-controlled financial clearing systems. Venezuela wasn't just integrating with China. Venezuela was integrating into a Chinese sphere of influence that extended across multiple countries and created operational efficiencies that would be impossible to replicate through traditional bilateral relationships. This regional integration strategy explains why Saturday's operation created opportunities for China rather than obstacles, why the removal of the Maduro government actually accelerated Chinese consolidation of Venezuelan infrastructure rather than disrupting it. The moment Venezuelan political authority became uncertain, the moment Venezuelan government oversight of infrastructure systems ceased to function effectively, Chinese operational control over those systems automatically expanded to fill the governance vacuum that American intervention had created. The legal frameworks that China had negotiated for its Venezuelan infrastructure investments were specifically designed to function independently of Venezuelan political authority, were structured to provide Chinese companies with operational autonomy that would not require ongoing government approvals or political negotiations. When American forces extracted Maduro, when Venezuelan government functions ceased to operate normally, Chinese infrastructure management continued without interruption, because it had been designed to operate independently of Venezuelan political oversight. This operational independence wasn't accidental. It was the result of careful legal engineering that anticipated exactly the kind of political disruption that occurred on Saturday morning. Every Chinese infrastructure contract in Venezuela included provisions for operational continuity during government transitions, provisions that would allow Chinese companies to maintain control over critical systems, regardless of political chaos or regime change. China wasn't just investing in Venezuelan infrastructure. They were creating operational protocols that would survive any political eventuality. The power generation systems that China installed throughout Venezuela require Chinese technical specialists for routine maintenance, require Chinese replacement parts for operational continuity, require Chinese operational protocols for efficient management. This means that any attempt to remove Chinese influence from Venezuelan electrical infrastructure would result in immediate system failures, widespread blackouts, economic disruption that would make political stability impossible to maintain. China didn't just build Venezuelan infrastructure, they built Venezuelan dependence on Chinese infrastructure management. The special economic zones that China established in Venezuelan territory over the past 5 years weren't just investment platforms, they were governance experiments, testing grounds for administrative systems that could operate independently of Venezuelan political authority and create alternative frameworks for economic management that would function regardless of who controlled the central government in Caracas. Saturday's operation transformed these experimental zones into operational realities that could expand across Venezuelan territory. When China negotiated the establishment of special economic zones in Venezuelan ports, in Venezuelan mining regions, in Venezuelan manufacturing areas, they weren't just creating investment opportunities. They were creating extraterritorial administrative systems that would operate under Chinese management protocols rather than Venezuelan regulatory frameworks. These zones function as economic enclaves where Chinese companies can operate under Chinese legal systems, Chinese labor regulations, Chinese environmental standards, Chinese financial oversight. The sophistication of these arrangements becomes clear when you realize that the special economic zones were designed to interface directly with Chinese financial systems, Chinese logistics networks, Chinese supply chains, creating operational efficiencies that would make Chinese management of Venezuelan economic activity more effective than Venezuelan management of Venezuelan economic activity. Companies operating within these zones conduct their transactions in yuan rather than bolivars, follow Chinese operational protocols rather than Venezuelan regulatory requirements, report to Chinese administrative authorities rather than Venezuelan government agencies. This administrative independence explains why the extraction of Maduro actually accelerated the expansion of Chinese special economic zones rather than disrupting their operations. The moment Venezuelan political authority became uncertain, the moment Venezuelan regulatory oversight ceased to function effectively, the administrative systems that China had established within the special economic zones automatically expanded to fill the governance vacuum that American intervention had created. The legal frameworks that govern these zones were specifically designed to function independently of Venezuelan political transitions, were structured to provide Chinese administrative authorities with governance powers that would not require approval from whatever political entity emerged to replace the Maduro government. China wasn't just creating investment opportunities in Venezuela. They were creating alternative governance systems that could absorb Venezuelan economic activity into Chinese administrative frameworks. Consider what happens when special economic zones begin expanding beyond their original territorial boundaries. When Chinese administrative systems begin managing Venezuelan economic activity that falls outside the formal zone structures, when Chinese operational protocols begin replacing Venezuelan regulatory frameworks across larger sections of Venezuelan territory. This isn't just economic development, this is administrative substitution, the replacement of Venezuelan governance with Chinese governance through economic integration rather than political conquest. The expansion potential of these zones becomes significant when you realize that they were designed to accommodate rapid scaling, were built with administrative infrastructure that could manage much larger territories and much more complex economic activities than their current operations require. The moment Venezuelan political authority became unable to provide effective governance, the moment Venezuelan regulatory systems ceased to function reliably, Chinese Special Economic Zone administrators were prepared to expand their operational territories to maintain economic stability. The manufacturing facilities that Chinese companies established within these zones require Chinese supply chains for raw materials, Chinese logistics networks for product distribution, Chinese financial systems for transaction processing. This creates operational dependencies that make the zones increasingly independent of Venezuelan economic infrastructure, while simultaneously making Venezuelan economic activity increasingly dependent on Chinese operational systems. But the strategic significance of these zones becomes visible when you examine how they interface with similar Chinese-operated zones across Latin America, creating a regional network of Chinese-administered territories that can coordinate economic activity independently of national government oversight, independently of traditional diplomatic relationships, independently of the political boundaries that normally define economic sovereignty. Venezuela's special economic zones aren't isolated experiments. They're components of a larger Chinese economic empire that operates through administrative integration rather than political conquest. The currency swap agreements that China negotiated with Venezuela starting in 2018 were not just bilateral financial arrangements. They were the foundation for a regional financial architecture that could process economic transactions independently of dollar-denominated clearing systems, independently of American financial oversight, independently of the regulatory frameworks that traditionally gave Washington leverage over international monetary relationships. When Venezuela agreed to conduct 85% of its trade with China in yuan, rather than dollars, when Venezuelan oil exports began flowing to Chinese refineries under yuan-denominated pricing agreements, Venezuela was essentially joining a financial network that extended across multiple Latin American countries and created operational alternatives to the dollar-based international monetary system. This wasn't just currency diversification, this was integration into a parallel financial architecture that could challenge American monetary hegemony. The scope of this network becomes visible when you realize that China has established similar currency swap arrangements with Brazil, with Argentina, with numerous other Latin American countries, creating a regional financial system that can process transactions, clear payments, manage currency exchanges without requiring dollar intermediation or American financial system participation. Every country that joins this network increases its operational capacity and reduces the network's dependence on traditional international financial infrastructure. The timing of Venezuela's integration into this network becomes significant when you examine how rapidly Venezuelan yuan usage accelerated in the months leading up to Saturday's operation, almost as if Chinese financial strategists knew that they would soon need payment systems that could function independently of Venezuelan government authorization, payment systems that could continue operating even if Venezuelan political authority fell under American control or ceased to exist entirely. Consider what happens to international financial relationships when the traditional clearing systems become unavailable, when dollar-denominated transactions become impossible due to sanctions or political disruption, when the established financial infrastructure can no longer process the payments that keep international trade functioning. Under normal circumstances, such financial disruption would create massive economic chaos, would trigger trade collapses, an investment flight, and potentially catastrophic disruptions to economic activity. But China had been building alternative financial infrastructure that would actually benefit from the kind of disruption that occurred on Saturday morning infrastructure that could absorb Venezuelan trade relationships into Chinese financial networks and maintain operational continuity regardless of political chaos in Caracas. Every yuan-denominated transaction that Venezuela conducted with China over the past 18 months created operational pathways that could function independently of Venezuelan government oversight. The sophistication of these arrangements becomes clear when you realize that the currency swap networks include not just bilateral China-Venezuela agreements, but multilateral arrangements that allow Venezuelan yuan reserves to facilitate trade relationships with third countries that also participate in Chinese financial networks. Venezuela can use yuan earned from oil exports to China to purchase manufactured goods from Brazil, to finance infrastructure projects with Argentina, to conduct regional trade that never requires dollar conversion or American financial system participation. This multilateral functionality explains why Saturday's operation created opportunities for Chinese financial expansion rather than obstacles. Why the removal of Venezuelan political authority actually accelerated Venezuelan integration into Chinese financial networks rather than disrupting that integration. The moment Venezuelan government oversight of financial relationships ceased to function effectively, Venezuelan economic activity automatically flowed into the alternative financial infrastructure that China had been constructing for exactly this contingency. The clearing systems that process yuan-denominated transactions between China and Latin American countries operate independently of SWIFT, independently of American financial oversight, independently of the regulatory frameworks that traditionally gave Washington visibility into and control over international financial flows. This creates operational space for economic relationships that function outside traditional American influence, relationships that could expand rapidly if dollar-based financial systems became unavailable or unreliable. The coordination between American military planning and Chinese financial positioning in the months leading up to Saturday's operation suggests a level of strategic communication between Washington and Beijing that most people never suspected, communication that allowed both powers to prepare for Venezuelan regime change in ways that would serve their respective interests, without directly conflicting with each other as operational objectives. Consider the timeline. Trump announced his intention to remove Maduro from power in late 2024. American naval forces began their Caribbean buildup in early 2025. Chinese financial institutions accelerated their restructuring of Venezuelan investments throughout the same period, and the actual extraction occurred at precisely the moment when Chinese operational preparations had reached completion. This coordination wasn't coincidental. It was the result of strategic planning that anticipated mutual benefits from regime change. The sophistication of this coordination becomes visible when you examine how American intelligence services allowed Chinese financial activities to continue and expand in Venezuela, even as American sanctions tightened, even as American military pressure increased, even as American diplomatic efforts to isolate the Maduro regime intensified. Washington never seriously attempted to disrupt Chinese economic operations in Venezuela, never imposed secondary sanctions that would have forced Chinese companies to choose between Venezuelan markets and American markets. This restraint wasn't oversight. It was strategic calculation based on the understanding that Chinese economic integration with Venezuela would actually serve American interests by creating alternative governance mechanisms that could maintain stability and operational continuity in a post-Maduro environment. America wanted to remove Maduro. China wanted to consolidate its economic position, and both objectives could be achieved simultaneously through coordinated timing that served both powers' strategic interests. The intelligence sharing that made this coordination possible wasn't formal diplomatic communication. It was operational synchronization that allowed American military planners to schedule their intervention at precisely the moment when Chinese financial preparations had created sufficient infrastructure to manage post-regime change economic stability. America needed Chinese operational capacity to prevent economic collapse. China needed American political intervention to eliminate the primary obstacle to economic consolidation. But the deeper strategic logic becomes clear when you realize that both Washington and Beijing understood that Venezuelan regime change would create regional precedents for American-Chinese cooperation that could be replicated in other Latin American markets, precedents that would allow both powers to expand their influence through complementary rather than competitive strategies. America provides political intervention capacity. China provides economic integration capacity. And both powers benefit from outcomes that neither could achieve independently. The financial flows that accelerated between China and Venezuela in the weeks leading up to Saturday's operation were not random market activity. They were coordinated positioning that allowed Chinese institutions to complete their preparation for post-Maduro operations while providing American intelligence services with real-time visibility into Chinese intentions and operational capacity. This mutual transparency reduced the risk of strategic miscalculation during a complex intervention that required precise timing to achieve optimal outcomes for both powers. The communication protocols that enabled this coordination weren't visible to public oversight because they operated through intelligence channels rather than diplomatic channels, through operational coordination rather than political negotiation, through tactical cooperation rather than strategic alliance formation. Both powers maintained public positions that suggested competitive conflict while engaging in private coordination that served mutual strategic interests. The precedent that this coordination establishes becomes significant when you consider how it could be replicated in other Latin American countries, where Chinese economic integration has created similar dependencies, similar operational infrastructures, similar opportunities for regime change that would serve both American political objectives and Chinese economic objectives. Venezuela wasn't just a bilateral intervention, it was a template for American-Chinese cooperation that could reshape regional power dynamics across Latin America. The extraction of Maduro wasn't just the removal of a problematic ally, it was the elimination of a governance bottleneck that had been preventing Chinese economic interests from achieving their full operational potential in Venezuelan markets. A bottleneck that made the Maduro regime more valuable to China as a memory than as an ongoing political reality. Consider what the Maduro government had become by late 2024. A political apparatus so dysfunctional that it could no longer effectively manage the economic relationships that had kept it in power. So corrupt that it was diverting resources needed for infrastructure maintenance. So unstable that it was creating operational uncertainties that made long-term planning impossible for Chinese companies operating in Venezuelan markets. The corruption that characterized Maduro's final years in power wasn't just political scandal, it was operational obstacle to Chinese economic efficiency in Venezuelan markets. Because every transaction required multiple layers of political approval. Every operational decision required navigation through Byzantine bureaucratic processes. Every strategic initiative required negotiation with government officials who were more interested in personal enrichment than economic development. China's tolerance for political dysfunction has limits, particularly when that dysfunction begins interfering with operational efficiency and economic returns on massive infrastructure investments. When client-state relationships become more expensive to maintain than they are valuable to preserve. When political partnerships begin creating more obstacles than opportunities, strategic calculations shift toward alternative arrangements that can provide better operational outcomes. The financial restructuring that China conducted in Venezuela over the past 18 months wasn't just risk mitigation, it was preparation for post-client state operations. Preparation that would allow Chinese economic interests to function more effectively without the political complications that the Maduro regime had been creating. China wasn't just protecting its investments from political instability, they were positioning themselves to benefit from the elimination of political obstacles to economic efficiency. The operational improvements that Chinese companies could achieve without Maduro's interference became clear in the weeks following Saturday Murillo's extraction, when Chinese infrastructure projects began operating with enhanced efficiency, when Chinese administrative systems expanded their territorial coverage without requiring political negotiations, when Chinese financial networks processed Venezuelan transactions without requiring government approvals that had been creating delays and uncertainties. This efficiency gain explains why Chinese officials expressed only perfunctory concern about Maduro's removal while simultaneously announcing their intention to expand their operational presence in Venezuelan markets. China wasn't losing a valuable political relationship. They were gaining operational freedom that would allow them to manage their Venezuelan investments more effectively than had been possible under Maduro's increasingly dysfunctional administration. The client-state model that China had been using in Venezuela was designed for political environments where local governments could provide effective administration of Chinese economic interests. But that model becomes counterproductive when local political authority becomes so corrupt and dysfunctional that it creates more problems than it solves. At that point, direct operational control becomes more efficient than indirect political influence. The transition from client-state management to direct operational control wasn't a response to Maduro's extraction. It was a strategic shift that had been planned for months. A shift that would allow Chinese economic interests to achieve their full potential in Venezuelan markets without the political complications that had been limiting their effectiveness. Maduro's removal simply accelerated a transition that Chinese strategic planners had already determined was necessary. Saturday's operation represented more than regime change in a single Latin American country. It represented the practical demonstration that multipolar competition between great powers could produce coordinated outcomes that serve multiple strategic interests, simultaneously outcomes that challenge traditional assumptions about zero-sum competition between rising and established powers. The success of American-Chinese coordination in Venezuela establishes operational precedents that could reshape global power relationships, because it demonstrates that rising powers and established powers can cooperate strategically when their interests align around specific regional objectives, even when their broader global competition continues across other domains and geographic regions. Consider the implications of this precedent for other regions, where American political interests and Chinese economic interests could align around regime change objectives, around infrastructure development projects, around resource extraction agreements that would benefit both powers while serving their respective strategic objectives. Venezuela wasn't an isolated case. It was a prototype for American-Chinese cooperation that could be replicated wherever similar opportunities arise. The multipolar framework that enabled this cooperation doesn't require formal alliance structures or comprehensive strategic partnerships. It only requires tactical coordination around specific objectives, where mutual benefits can be achieved through complementary rather than competitive strategies. This operational model allows great powers to cooperate selectively while maintaining competitive relationships across other domains. The regional implications become significant when you realize that Latin America contains numerous countries where similar American-Chinese coordination could serve both powers' strategic interests, countries where Chinese economic integration has created dependencies that could benefit from American political intervention, countries where American political objectives could benefit from Chinese economic stabilization capacity. Brazil represents an obvious candidate for this kind of coordination, where Chinese infrastructure investments have created operational dependencies that could benefit from American political influence, where American strategic interests could benefit from Chinese economic integration that reduces regional instability and creates predictable governance frameworks. Argentina, Chile, Peru all present similar opportunities for coordinated American-Chinese engagement that would serve both powers' regional objectives. The institutional frameworks that would enable this coordination already exist in the form of bilateral investment treaties, multilateral development banks, regional trade agreements that provide legal structure for American-Chinese economic cooperation without requiring formal political alliance formation. The operational precedent that Venezuela established demonstrates how these existing frameworks could be utilized for strategic coordination around specific regional objectives. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative provides institutional capacity for infrastructure development and economic integration. American military and intelligence capabilities provide capacity for political intervention and regime stabilization. And the combination of these capabilities creates operational possibilities that neither power could achieve independently. Venezuela demonstrated the effectiveness of this complementary approach to regional power projection. The acceleration of multipolar cooperation that Saturday's operation represents doesn't eliminate American-Chinese competition. It channels that competition into more sophisticated forms that allow both powers to achieve strategic objectives through coordination rather than confrontation. This evolution toward coordinated competition could reduce the risks of great power conflict while enabling more effective management of regional challenges that neither power could address independently. The global implications extend beyond Latin America, because the operational model that proved effective in Venezuela could be adapted to other regions where American political capabilities and Chinese economic capabilities could combine to achieve strategic objectives that serve both powers' interests. The Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa all contain similar opportunities for selective American-Chinese coordination around specific objectives. The infrastructure that China built in Venezuela over the past 15 years, the currency networks that now process Venezuelan international transactions, the administrative systems that manage Venezuelan economic activity, all function independently of dollar-denominated financial systems. And Saturday's operation accelerated their expansion into a comprehensive alternative to American monetary hegemony that could challenge dollar dominance across Latin America and beyond. When Venezuelan oil exports flow to Chinese refineries under yuan-denominated contracts, when Venezuelan infrastructure projects are financed through Chinese development banks, when Venezuelan international trade is processed through Chinese clearing systems, the dollar becomes irrelevant to Venezuelan economic activity. And Venezuela's economic relationships begin operating outside the financial networks that traditionally gave Washington influence over international economic relationships. The precedent that this creates becomes significant when you realize that similar de-dollarization infrastructure is expanding across multiple Latin American countries, across Africa, across Southeast Asia, creating a global network of alternative financial systems that could process international transactions independently of American financial oversight, independently of dollar-denominated clearing systems, independently of the regulatory frameworks that have sustained American monetary hegemony since the end of World War II. Consider what happens when enough countries join this alternative financial network, when enough international trade begins flowing through yuan-denominated systems, when enough global economic activity begins operating outside dollar-based infrastructure. At that point, the dollar's role as the essential international currency begins to erode, and American financial influence begins to contract toward the borders of countries that remain dependent on dollar-denominated systems. The operational capacity that China demonstrated in Venezuela, the ability to maintain economic stability and administrative continuity during political transitions through alternative financial infrastructure, represents a model that could be replicated wherever countries seek to reduce their dependence on American monetary systems. Venezuela wasn't just a bilateral success, it was a demonstration project for global de-dollarization. The speed at which Venezuelan economic activity integrated into Chinese financial networks following Saturday's operation suggests that similar transitions could occur rapidly in other countries where Chinese infrastructure investments have created comparable operational capacity, where Chinese financial systems have established comparable alternative clearing mechanisms, where Chinese administrative systems have developed comparable governance capabilities. The coordination between American political intervention and Chinese economic expansion that Saturday's operation demonstrated establishes a template for managed transitions away from American monetary hegemony transitions that serve American strategic interests in specific regions, while simultaneously advancing Chinese objectives for global financial system transformation. This coordination reduces the risks associated with de-dollarization while accelerating the pace at which it occurs. The institutional frameworks that enable this kind of managed transition already exist in the form of Chinese development banks, Chinese currency swap networks, Chinese infrastructure development programs that provide alternative sources of international financing and economic integration that don't require participation in dollar-denominated financial systems. Venezuela demonstrated how these frameworks could absorb countries, transitioning away from American economic dependence. The global implications become clear when you realize that the financial infrastructure China used to manage Venezuelan economic integration during political transition could accommodate much larger economies, much more complex economic relationships, much more significant departures from dollar-based international financial systems. The operational model that succeeded in Venezuela could be scaled to accommodate regional economic blocs, continental trading relationships, global South economic integration that challenges Northern financial dominance. The future that Saturday's operation anticipated isn't a world without American power. It's a world where American power operates within more constrained geographic and institutional boundaries, where Chinese economic influence provides viable alternatives to American financial hegemony, where multipolar competition produces coordinated outcomes that serve multiple powers' interests while reducing any single power's capacity for global dominance. Venezuela was the opening move in a transition that will reshape international economic relationships for decades to come. The extraction of Nicolas Maduro from Venezuelan soil wasn't the end of a crisis. It was the beginning of a transformation that had been years in preparation. A transformation that demonstrates how great power competition evolves toward coordination when strategic interests align around specific objectives that serve multiple powers simultaneously. What appeared to be an American military victory was actually the triggering event for a Chinese economic consolidation that had been designed to benefit from exactly this kind of political disruption, designed to convert crisis into opportunity through operational protocols that had been embedded in Chinese infrastructure investments for precisely this contingency. The precedent that this coordination establishes extends far beyond Venezuela, far beyond Latin America, establishing operational models for American-Chinese cooperation that could reshape global power relationships wherever similar opportunities arise, wherever rising powers and established powers discover mutual benefits in coordinated rather than competitive engagement. The infrastructure is already in place, the institutional frameworks already exist, the operational precedents have been established. What remains is the gradual expansion of these models into other markets, other regions, other strategic relationships where multipolar coordination could serve multiple powers' interests while transforming the international system in ways that no single power could achieve independently. The dollar's dominance was never permanent. It was simply the most efficient available system for processing international transactions. But efficiency is contextual, and when alternative systems provide superior operational outcomes for specific relationships, for specific regions, for specific strategic objectives, the migration toward those alternatives becomes inevitable rather than ideological. Saturday morning in Caracas wasn't the end of Venezuelan independence. It was the beginning of Venezuelan integration into a different sphere of influence. Integration that demonstrates how economic sovereignty transfers from one power to another through infrastructure rather than conquest, through financial systems rather than political control, through operational efficiency rather than ideological alignment. The world that emerges from this transition won't be unipolar or bipolar, it will be multipolar in ways that allow different powers to dominate different regions through different capabilities, creating a more complex but potentially more stable international system where competition and cooperation exist simultaneously across different domains and different geographic areas. The real question isn't whether this transition will continue, it's whether it will proceed through coordination or confrontation, whether rising, and established powers will learn to manage their competition through institutional frameworks that serve multiple interests, or whether they will pursue zero-sum strategies that serve no one's long-term interests. Venezuela provided one answer to that question.